free. I hear you, Lord, but you tell me why me? Because it's again the time to get salvation for the down the line. The deacons say, put my people down. Don't argue with me, don't you mess around. Don't mess around.
Well, it's really Presbycast, and we're really early. We're an hour early. We might have done this before, just a time or two, but it's an hour too early for Presbycast. So if the show is much worse than usual, that's the reason. And if it's much better than usual, we're still not going to make this a regular starting time. Sorry. Resby is not able to make it when we go this early, so he's not with us, and that's one of the reasons we don't go this early. And I'll remind everyone, Presbycast was Resby's idea, so he's essential to the program. But so are our guests tonight on this kind of PCA-centric show. Although that's not to say that this discussion of officers, ordination, titles, and deacons don't have any relevance to other denominations. It's a live issue in the ARP and the RPCNA, who have some female deacon-like officers, and who knows, there may be people in the EPC that would like to do something different than they presently do. But I think this is a perennial topic, but it's a very live topic in the PCA, and as we'll discuss, I think it's going to be the issue of 2026 at the upcoming General Assembly in Louisville, Kentucky. So we do have three guests. We've got a regular, semi-regular, a podcaster himself, Jared Nelson of Polity Matters. I'm almost sure he gets treated better on this podcast than he does on his own. Prophet is not without honor except in his home country. So, Jared, you can unmute and say good evening to us and tell us how cold it is in Pennsylvania.
It just warmed up to be in the 50s, but now back to about freezing. So, yeah, I'm at New Life near Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, and I'm just trying to keep warm.
It's an unspellable word. The name for your church or your town or whatever it is, township. I don't know what they have in Pennsylvania.
It was a Native American queen or something.
Well, but we won't call you our Native American queen. We won't do that.
Please don't.
All right. So, Jared, we've got a teaching elder in the PCA, and we have another. He's really the precipitating event or the catalyst for tonight's show. Some work that he's done. You can see it on the screen. Thomas Rickard. Is it pronounced Rickard, Thomas?
Ricard.
No, Ricard. Like Captain Picard, or there's a strange French liquor called Ricard. I don't know if you knew that. It's clear, but when you pour water in it, it turns lemon yellow, and it's what old men drink in the south of France. Paul Ricard. So, I've been calling you Rickard, but Ricard, we'll do that, as in like Ricardo without the O. Right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, you're in the Westminster Presbytery, but tell us exactly where.
So I live in Glade Spring, Virginia, which is 30 miles north of the Tennessee border on 81. So everything around here is exit numbers. And so we live on exit number 29 on 81. So we're 29 miles up the border from Bristol, Tennessee. And so,
So Westminster Presbytery is just northeast Tennessee and a little bit of southwest Virginia.
Southwest Virginia, all the way up to 77, so almost up to Wytheville.
Okay. Well, just not a lot of humanity in that corner of the state. So, but I have been to one of the Virginia churches up there where our friend B.L. Peters, who I think has been your clerk up there, or your moderator. Sorry, you're the clerk, right?
Well, he was clerk last time. I had to go do a funeral, and so BL was the person that chose the short straw. He chairs our administrative committee, and so he was the person I called upon, and he agreed to help out.
Well, I've been to his church on the way to General Assembly. How did that? Well, yeah, on the way to Richmond. Yeah, that makes sense. That's what it was. All right. Well, we're glad to have you with us, and we're going to talk about some things you've written, which I decided were much better than all the many things I have written on this topic. And so that's what we'll do. But we also want to welcome Dave Sias, or Sias, like Isaias.
I accept both pronunciations, both the continental and the English translation. Yeah. Hey, good to be back. David Sias, Katy, Texas. I guess I'm the outgoing moderator of the Houston Metro Presbytery.
Wow.
Actually,
We got real Presbyterians here.
well, you couldn't get Bob Mattis, so I wore his shirt. But then you'd really have Presbyterians. But yeah, now that I think about it, I'm not outgoing. I'm not gone. Monday night was my last moderating meeting, and so I've passed the gavel on to someone else.
Yeah, I guess becoming moderator is like what they say about buying a boat. You know, the best day of your life is becoming moderator, and the second best day is when you unbecome being the moderator.
Oh, I don't know about that. The Houston Metro Presbytery is a good presbytery. We have some really good fathers and brothers here, and with like one exception, all of our meetings were really pretty congenial, and the Presbyterians were not too unruly. We actually behaved ourselves mostly, so I'm grateful for that.
I was asked to stand for moderator once, and for a term. And I decided I knew much better than the person asking me that I wouldn't be any good at it. So I said no. And but we've had a string of good ones. We've got a ruling elder now who's extremely competent and know my limitations. But lots of, I'm sure, Jared, have you been clerk or moderator of your presbytery?
I have been moderator. I would not take over our clerk's job because it's Jay Nykirk, and he would do a better job than me.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a high functioning ruling elder. I guess we'll give Dave the same credit for high functioning.
Well, no, actually, you're actually right. Having someone like Jay Nykirk as your clerk makes it so that almost anybody could be the moderator. So in my case, I have an extremely competent clerk by the name of Eric Monti. Some of you may know him. Eric is a terrific guy and a very, very competent clerk. And he kind of saved my bacon on more than one occasion. So as long as you have a competent clerk, you can get by with almost any dummy as moderator. And the Houston Metro Presbytery just did. So.
All right. So we'll get on with business here, but B.L. Peters, who's up there with you, Thomas, he says, being moderator is not as bad as owning a boat. So your nautical mileage may vary, we might say. All right, so we're here to talk. We did a show on this general topic a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, but I can sense the tension rising on this issue. I know of overtures on each side of the issue that are coming. I know of some overtures that have been tried before that are going to be recycled, it seems. I know of actual live controversy in presbyteries over this, and we know that there was a lot of internet chatter about it, although that seems to have died down. But the range of practice and understanding and regard for these issues in the PCA has become apparent, for better or worse. People like the people we have on the show tonight have been talking about it for years, but not necessarily on the open internet. Most church business is best done quietly and through channels, but it's okay for us to talk about these things. So I guess we'll start. I think all three of you guys, I assume Thomas has read the greater part of what he's written, but our other two guests have read most of it too. And I actually used, because of my commute, I signed up with Medium, which is where you publish this, and I listened as well as read these articles, and that was fine. You have to get over the idiosyncrasies of the way these AI, readers read things, but you can make that work. So I recommend that. But Thomas, as I read what you wrote, and there's 5-6 articles now, and you're going to have 2 or 3 more, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I might just keep on writing. If other people might help, I write a lot, but most of the time I don't publish it because I just get it off my head and down onto paper. And so sometimes I'll send something to someone else, but maybe not as polished. But we'll see how far it goes.
Well, what's clear to me is that you've been thinking about this a lot, and probably for a long time, because you don't get to the level of reasoning and detail that you have in these pieces without it's not something you just came to or just started thinking about. And let me start out by asking you this: as I've tried to write about these issues, the practices are so varied, and the number of things that, from our perspective, are wrong. It's hard to know where to start. You have to go through the principles and the provisions of the PCO very carefully and slowly, which is what you've done here, to really describe it. Was that your experience?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about the ways people can imagine things, it's endless. That's why Dr. Kerr at RTS, he said, when you get Bible-believing people together, even in their different interpretations of the Bible, they're going to come to similar conclusions. Once you start going into the liberal spectrum of things, you just have no idea what they're going to come up with in their interpretation of the Bible because they're so variant. And so what I've sought to be able to do is really focus on what we have written rather than all the variant practices that are about there, and specifically trying to challenge what I think is maybe the most articulate and reasoned position of the other side of that non-ordained commissioned deaconess, and trying to think, if this is the best practice of it, then where are the weaknesses in that practice? And so that's how I tried to go about it.
Well, you were far more measured and winsome and reasonable than I have ever been as I've written about these things, and that's to be commended. You have the ability to do that. Your first article was called "Christ Officers Are Sufficient," and as I have, you leaned heavily on that underrated and overlooked part of our book of church order, the preface and the preliminary principles. It's a very important part that most people skip over, but really it makes some radical claims about officers and Christ's church and His provision for His church. So let's just talk about what you wrote generally in this first article. Christ, the officers, the offices given by Christ are sufficient.
Yeah, so I think that when asked to describe what Presbyterian polity is, I think often we'll go, well, it's elder rule, that it's presbyters that are ruling, or that we might go to distinctives of practice like infant baptism or covenant worship or other things like that, where we say this is what we're known for. I think Presbyterian polity is best summed up with the understanding that Christ is head and king of His church. That's what Presbyterian polity is. And as king and head of His church, He has given and instructed and blessed His church with the opening says there's 3 O's that He gives: ordinances, officers, and officers and oracles. And so He gives those things to His church. And specifically, when we're talking about offices, that's what we see in Ephesians chapter 4. Paul begins in Ephesians chapter 4 and explains that what unites us is that one baptism, one faith, one hope, one spirit. But then he goes into the diversity of the body, and he says that as Christ ascended into heaven, He then bestows gifts upon His church. And the gifts that He says He gives the church is that of apostles and prophets, evangelists, teachers, and shepherds, and teachers. And the purpose of those gifts that he gives his church is then to equip and train people for ministry. And so when talking about, officers ordained, and then how men and women, specifically who are not ordained, how they carry out that work, I think it's important to be able to know that we don't get into this classification of sacred and secular, that here ministry is that what is secular, sacred, and then everything else we do is secular. That was one of the downfalls with the Roman Catholic Church, is they saw the elevation of the priesthood and downplayed the ministry of the work of people. But Paul continues to be able to say that the shepherds and teachers are to equip the saints for the work of ministry. So the whole church does the work of ministry. And so he gives those officers to be able to help equip the church for ministry. And so I think there's we often, I think, move towards this business model of organizational structure. And that's what I think ministry turns into. You need professionals. But that opening statement, I think, is very, very clear that Christ has given us those officers and the office. So he's given us the office of elder and deacon, and he's also blessed us with officers in the church. He gives both.
Yeah, so not everything about our church is simple. Our processes and our order when we come to judicial matters and the trials and things like that, they're necessarily complex. But there are but two offices. We are a two-office church. I think one of the things that's opened the door for some of these things in the PCA is there are a lot of guys who really would tell you that, well, I'm a three-office guy. They don't really buy the one office of elder with two classes. There were even guys at General Assembly who would mark out TE and write pastor on their name tag as a silent protest. Passive aggressive, I think I would say more than silent. But we only have two offices, and that's simple. And we only have two sacraments. Rome had 7. How many different types of officers Rome has, I don't know, half dozen or more. The Anglican Church is very complicated. I mean, ask someone to explain to you the polity of the ACNA. Even the people in the ACNA can't do it. It's not well defined. It's open ended. It's kind of local option. Same with Lutherans, really. The LCMS is that it's not none of it's as simple as ours. Yet we want to clutter it up. And you talked about the corporate model. People want to replicate corporate models in the church, I'm afraid, where there are a lot of titles and where it's very egalitarian, almost by law these days. But I think you were near this point earlier. This is a divine thing. It's a different organization. It's supernaturally given and defined, and we should not expect the church to look like our workplace or a school or university or the military. It's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, if I could just say, I like the fact that Thomas has been highlighting what is it, the 4th paragraph there in the preface. I think it's so often overlooked. I think it's worth even reading. Where this is in our BCO before you get to all the chapters, but in the first part, 4th paragraph, Christ as King has given to his church officers, oracles, and ordinances, and especially has he ordained therein his system of doctrine, government, discipline, and worship, all of which are either expressly set down in Scripture or by a good and necessary inference may be deduced therefrom. And to which things he commands that nothing be added, and that from them not be taken away. And I think we forget sometimes that we believe in we'll talk about the regular principle in terms of worship, but there's a sense in which that applies to the church. Now, there's certain things, committees, whatever way that you do things, what time you meet, that are left to the light of nature, but the offices are not left to the light of nature. To the broad categories of the government of the church are not. And if we believe that Christ is king over the church, I think you're reminding us there of something that perhaps we've forgotten.
Yeah, and you make a lot of that, Thomas, of this idea that it's all given by Christ. But yeah, you say, as others have said, we really have a regulative principle of polity, not just of worship. But I'm afraid sometimes we don't. We're not much better at honoring the regulative principle of polity than we are with the regulative principle of worship. Of course, we're going to disagree on that. Dave, if I'm not wrong, you're a lawyer, and do you think this is it's pretty clear, and that I assume with legal work, you go to first principles when you can, you go to foundational documents, and you work from there, and that's what we're doing here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. This it's pretty unassailable, frankly, what Thomas has pulled together here from our first principles. Fundamentally, we ultimately get down to the text. What does the text say within the four corners of whatever the particular instrument or chapter or document or whatever it is? The four corners of the BCO is fairly voluminous, right? And so taking one piece in isolation of the rest is a bad idea. So being informed by these first principles, as we read through the BCO is very helpful.
All right, Thomas, what else in this first piece should we touch on before we quickly summarize some of the other ones? We've talked about Christ as King, and a lot of people like to say that these days. Christ is Lord, Christ is King. It's become a political statement almost, but it really first applies to the church, and especially applies to the church. So what else about this first piece is you think is helpful?
Well, I think when we come to talk about all of this, we come back to the teaching of Sola Scriptura, which is found in Westminster Confession 1.6. And Sola Scriptura, we think, often says that it needs to be explicitly taught in Scripture. And that's often how we understand the regulative principle of worship. It needs to be done in worship. We need a direct command. And that is true, but also that's not the whole principle at work as the Westminster Divines understood it. Because then we don't have the direct command in Scripture that the Lord's Day is now moved to the first day of the week rather than the seventh day. What we have is then not only explicit command, but also what the Divines call good and necessary consequence. And so we can deduce from there certain things, and we apply that principle not only to worship, but also to government. That's what they say in 1.6, is they say that there are certain circumstances that are directed in government by light of nature and Christian prudence. And so there's a good overlap between government and worship in the Westminster Confession. Even in the second commandment in Westminster Larger Catechism 108 actually says that the second commandment deals with government in the church. And so I think we need to start with that foundation and let Scripture then guide how Christ wants his church to be structured, and not adding to it or taking away from it. So in some sense, when we add additional officers, and people might say, well, they're not technical officers, but in function and form, maybe they might not be classified that in your definition, but if that's what they are, they're performing those functions that are given to shepherds. That's one of the key things in chapter 8, is that they are shepherds. That's what they're called in 1 Peter chapter 5, in Acts chapter 20. And so what we see is they're given, so we don't want to add to it, but we also don't want to take it away. And I think there's a danger that in that adding to or potential adding to, we're actually taking away from what they are. If there are two officers and we live out the mantra that a woman can do whatever a non-ordained man can do, and that definition of what can an ordained man do, often that's a very small list. They can vote in meetings, they can administer sacraments, they can preach, and really it comes down to the teaching elders are how we view ordained officers, administering the sacraments and preaching, maybe administering discipline through a session. But realistically, we're losing what the diaconate does, and we're diminishing what the diaconate does. But in the structuring the church, Christ has given us both. That in Acts chapter 6, when the foundation of the diaconate comes, the technical term is not there, but that's where we see that beginning structure. It's not then the elders just say, let's just stop doing mercy ministry. Let's stop helping people's bodies here on earth. Let's just focus on word and prayer. They say it's so important. We need a whole nother group of people to attend to this care. And so they establish the work of the diaconate. And that's the practice that continues in churches. In Philippians chapter 1, you see elders and deacons. And there are qualifications in 1 Timothy chapter 3, elders and deacons. And so we need to stop making the diaconate just a small little, we're helping people out. It's a very important, very vital part of how Christ has structured his church. And often I think when deacons only focus on buildings and budgets, then they lose their main purpose that they exist. And so I really think that, we need to come back to this principle. How does Christ specifically and explicitly command his structure, his church? And let's stop trying to invent new ways. Christ, as I said clearly, his offices are sufficient. We don't need to add to or take away from what Christ has given.
Yeah, and so what we call the officers, how we describe them, how we present them, how we portray them, how we choose them, and it is all very important for that reason. So, Dave, if I'm not wrong, in law, some of the standards are, what would a reasonable person make of this, and what's that called? You're not expecting everyone involved in maybe a class action suit or something to have read all the constitutional documents of all the parties involved. There's kind of the what would a reasonable person assume, or what care would a reasonable person take? What's that called?
Right. I think you're referring to what's known as apparent authority. And the principle there is that if, like you said, a reasonable person would perceive the authority being represented as being on behalf of or in the stead of the body or the corporation that is being represented, then it's sufficient in some cases to bind the company to that. And so this is sort of a feature of corporate law. If you have a company of 12 people, you probably have one person who's authorized to bind the company, maybe two. If you have a company of 8,000 people, you're going to have some more people who are authorized formally to bind the company. But not everybody is. And so I've certainly seen situations where someone goes out and signs a document they shouldn't have signed because they didn't realize that they don't actually have the authority. They don't have a power of attorney, or they don't have some sort of invested formal authority from the corporation. Nevertheless, the law would uphold that instrument signed by that person because that person held themselves out, even if not formally or sort of notoriously. The act of them signing off on something like that shows the counterparty, that third party who didn't know better, right? It shows them that this is real authority on behalf of the corporation. And so, I think what you're getting at by analogy is, if we're putting people forward from the church who seem to have similar responsibilities, or they seem to have similar titles, or they seem to have substantially the same duties. Maybe they were brought up to the front of a worship service and introduced, or a congregational meeting. They were introduced as being part of some sort of diaconal team. I don't know what all the terms of art that people are using. That it really looks like these are people who are invested with authority to act on behalf of the church, maybe to act in ways relating to discipline, maybe to act in ways relating to shepherding or care of the church. And we shouldn't forget, and I think you touched on this, Thomas, that the office of deacon is a spiritual office. And so if we start saying, we typically think about it as, caring for the property, caring for the people, caring for widows and orphans, doing mercy ministry, things like that. But it is fundamentally a spiritual office. And so, when we start behaving as if all these people can be deacon adjacent, or we don't ordain any deacons, and we just have a batch of people who all seem to be doing those responsibilities, then it really starts to look like all of these people have that authority, and that the session has approved it and the session has put it forward. But I may be skipping ahead. I think.
Well, I'm going to drop a legal term on you. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, most people are going to think it's a duck. Now they don't know what species it is, but it's a duck. So yeah. And let me get this in, because I may forget to mention it later. I've been thinking about it, and I've implied it a couple of times. We're not down on people who want to serve the church. A well-meaning person who loves the church, session comes to him and says, "We want you to do this job. We want you to serve." Well, most people are going to say, "Sure, whatever you say." It's not the people who hold some of these, I'll say, bogus office titles. They didn't ask for them. They were asked to do this, and it's not really their place to know better and to understand it. I don't think ordained deacons in our church asked for this and brought it on, and said, "Give us all these adjuncts and give us all this." It's the sessions, it's the elders of the church, but usually it's the pastor leading on these things. And a lot of these churches are large and kind of top down, or they're fairly new churches where the only person in that congregation that knows much about anything Presbyterian wise is the pastor, and he may not know much. So I certainly don't blame the unordained people. I think it's the elders who should know better and should order the church properly. So this is not bashing any faithful servant of the church. It's more about what the sessions are doing.
But I think that also comes back to how we explain what ministry is. If we think ministry is always some formal, organized event that the church does, then I think we miss the largest portion of what Christians and saints are called to do. Is ministry is serving Christ through the calling in which he has placed them. And so sometimes that comes in an official ministry capacity through the church. But ministry is actually a mother raising her children in the fear and admonition of the Lord and serving those children. And ministry is a husband opening up his Bible with his wife and his children and teaching and instructing them and not provoking them to anger. That's his ministry in which he's called. And even as what's supposedly linked to Luther is that the handmaid who sweeps the floor brings glory to God. And so when we're equipping people for the work of ministry, we're equipping them for the work of service. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 25, when he separates the sheep and the goats, he says that I visited you in prison. I gave you clothes. You gave me clothes. You gave me something to eat. You gave me something to drink. And the goat said, well, we didn't see you. When did you do that? And he said, whatever you did to the least of these, you did unto me. And that's what ministry is. And so if we see ministry as something that is only organized by the church within the walls of the church, I think we're missing the greatest ministry opportunity that we have. That people are called in their various practices, and the office of the church should be equipping people for that work of ministry, that work of service. And so when we see ministry as the callings God has given us to, and that we're serving Christ through that calling, I think that really changes what we do. Everyone is unordained until they're ordained, but everyone is called where God has placed them. We have a faithful elder in our church. She's 82, she's 80, she's got very severe dementia. He is carrying out that ministry faithfully by loving her and caring for her. He served the church 50 years teaching Bible study and Sunday school. Both of those are ministry. Both of those are ministries that are carried out in his particular calling, along with being a shepherd, a ruling elder in the church. And he's faithfully carried out all of those various callings. And so he is doing ministry by loving his wife as Christ loved the church now. Although he's not officially serving in the church through any of those other means. And so when we encourage and equip others to be able to do that, then ministry becomes such a broad context of what we do, that everyone is then a servant of Christ as they serve Christ in their calling.
Yeah, when I came to my church 21 years ago from Baptist world, it was just amazing. The church had no greeters program, but everyone was greeted. Every visitor was greeted. There was all this, I don't want to use a trendy word, organic. The people in the church just did things that we were always told you were supposed to do, but there was no program for it. People just did it. A lot of people think there's got to be a program for everything in the church. And of course, if there's a program, there's got to be a committee. If there's a committee, there's got to be a leader. And pretty soon nothing's getting done because everybody is on a committee, or everyone has a title, or everyone is telling someone else what to do, and nobody's doing anything. So that's where the simplicity comes back in. But as I think you pointed out more than once, Thomas, it's the people should be being taught that they have important work to do, and it's just it varies by station. But that doctrine of vocation is probably neglected. It's probably not. It's not taught as much as it ought to be. Any thoughts on that, Jared? I mean, you're the pastor of a church, and you deal with all these things every day.
Yeah, I've said before, I think sometimes, especially when you have godly women in the church that want to help and serve or visit people or, get involved, often the men are sitting around debating what their titles are going to be, and the women are just like, we just want to serve. Like we're not really caring about the titles. It's really what the guys tend to be debating at the time, and not the women that want to serve. And so we need to have, committees, groups of people that are doing things, but there's when we have these directions about the offices, we need to be careful about distributing titles, because I think that's getting into the second part of what Thomas is writing on, semantic range. That's something I've wrestled with more and more. Is sometimes some churches have said, well, this person is a commissioned deacon, this person is a ordained deacon. And I have to wonder, what's the difference between commissioning and ordaining? We need to have different definitions. They're not synonymous, are they? Is there something special about ordination that is different, that gives some sort of authority? Whereas, typically commissioning is talking about a particular task for a short period of time, right? And if we don't have a difference of those words, they're going to become synonymous. And then ordination is lessened even more in our churches, which within broad evangelicalism, most people who are taking on the role of pastor, especially online, who examined you, who laid hands on you to say, no, you are examined to say that you have this title, these gifts, and here's the opportunity, and you're under authority, even as you're operating your authority. So that's my big question of, semantics actually is important. And the big one is, what's the difference between commissioning and ordaining? We have to have a different definition of those two things.
Yeah, and Thomas hasn't written about ordination yet, but I'm sure he will. But we'll talk about this semantic range question. But I think we should talk about how, when we make up roles we may hinder people doing things that they just would organically and naturally do anyway. Many years ago, when I served as a deacon for only 2 years, and we should make the point that deacon is not junior elder, and that everybody that serves as a deacon as a young man is going to automatically become a ruling elder one day. I did, and it often happens, but it doesn't always happen, and it shouldn't always happen. In fact, maybe it should be a lot rarer than it is. But we have this category in our BCO called deacon assistants. The session can appoint men and women. I think maybe in the earliest days of the PCA, it was women only, and it was sort of maybe trying to smooth the transition from the main line to the PCA. But we in several years ago, and I don't even remember the year, maybe it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, we made deacon assistants who can be appointed, not elected, appointed by the session. We made that a thing. Well, I went to a woman who, without any direction of her own volition, she was basically taking care of all the old ladies and widows in the church. She organized monthly events for them. She checked on them all at least weekly, sometimes more often than that. And I was a deacon, and I'm studying the BCO, and I thought, well, if we can make her a deacon assistant, we can take credit for all the stuff that she's doing. And at that time, the deacons weren't doing a lot in as far as taking care of widows. And I went to her, and she told me to get lost. She said, "This is what I do. These are my friends and fellow church members. I don't need a title." Just like somebody said earlier. So if again, when it becomes about the title rather than the service, I don't think it actually fosters more and better ministry outside of those titles for offices that Christ has given. So so let's talk about words. Some people say, "Well, this is just words." Well, no, it's office, and when we have some churches that only ordain elders anymore. We have churches, admittedly, as was admitted on the floor of General Assembly, that they don't ordain deacons because they think they should be able to ordain men and women, and they can't. So, as a concession or somehow as a protest, I don't know, they don't ordain their deacons anymore. So they have become a one-office Presbyterian church. When you have quasi-offices alongside of the ruling elders and the deacons, arguably you've added 2 offices. And there are some people that want the teaching elder to be a separate office. So we have some churches that look like 5-office churches. We got to decide if we're going to be 2 office, 1 office, 4 office, or 5 office. I'm going to vote for 2, but let's talk about the words for those real offices, Thomas. We're on this next article, which was published on October 14th.
Yeah, I mean, I think words really matter. I think understanding how the BCO use words, that's in another article. But, when we use the phrase deaconess, what do people actually hear when they hear that? It's not predominant in the West in history. It's not clear in the West in church history. It really falls out of practice. It never really was in practice a lot very consistently, but it falls out of practice with monastic vows and nuns in the West. So deaconess really is not predominant. But when someone hears deaconess today, what do they hear? Just hypothetically, say if the Westminster Confession of Faith had a chapter and said that what the BCO says, but had it more open, maybe what some people might like it, that there's 2 offices in the church, elder and deacon, and that the office of elder and deacon, or even just deacon, is open to men and women. and someone comes to the floor and says, I've got to state a difference. I believe that women should be called deaconesses rather than deacons, as the hypothetical Westminster says. What ruling would the presbytery give out of our 4 categories? My assumption would be that it's merely semantic. I doubt many presbyteries would rule that and say it's more than semantic, but out of not striking at accord with the fundamentals of our system. And so we have this term deaconess, and then all these other phrases that I think people, I don't think they're applied similarly. But what does deaconess actually mean? A female deacon is how people hear it. Most people don't know about the historical practices in the church in the West.
Yeah, and you make the good point that it's weird to take a Bible term in the Greek, diakonos, and to sex it in a way that the Bible never does. I'd never heard anyone make that point before, but the reason, I mean, we're going right back to, we're sort of making up a Greek word here for this, and I've never heard that point made before, but you have to be careful how you use Bible words.
Yeah, and I mean, that's most of the words that we get. Why are we called Presbyterian? Well, it's a Greek word that we get that from. Why are they called the deacons? It's a Greek word they get that from. Even pastor stems from, the Latin of shepherd. And so very similar, even an overlap similar to Greek. Even words like saints, like that's a church term that we use to be able to call all the people in the visible church. That's a Greek word. And so now we're coming up and we're saying, well, it's not an office, but we use a very similar nomenclature to be able to evaluate how it comes up as well. Again, going back to what Christ has given in his church, people will say, well, Paul calls Phoebe a deaconess. Well, I think, again, they're not looking at that language, and the PCA has an understanding of what that word means. We've already said that we don't believe the office of deacon is open to women. And so that phrase is used like the 24 other times in the Bible as servant. There's only 4 times it's used where it's translated as deacon. And they're official offices. And so, even in Ephesians chapter 4, where Paul says that equip the saints to be able to do the work of ministry, that work of ministry is the work of diaconate, work of service. And so, yeah, I think that being very clear about what these are and what the BCO does say. The BCO is not silent on the office of elder and what the titles are given and what the functions are. Read through chapter 8. It goes after time and time again that they're overseer, they're bishop, they're shepherd, they're pastor, they're teaching. These are the phrases that we use to be able to explain the office of elder. And they're rooted in biblical convictions. And so too with deacon. It's a very specific phrase. And I think it's unwise, particularly if we're trying to reach people that haven't been brought up studying church history. When they see a deaconess, what do they see and what do they hear? It's a female deacon in their mind, just like a waitress and a waiter, an actress and an actor.
Yeah, and that was a great point too. The actress thing. I've never heard anyone make that analogy, but that does help explain it a good bit. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I kind of had a question in terms of maybe a little pushback. I'm interested in what you'd say, Thomas. So within this, you acknowledge there's a bit of a history in the RPCES, and in the RPCES, which was absorbed into the PCA, or joining and receiving, but really absorbed into the PCA. In the 70s, they had a debate over this in their synods, and there was an overture to have women deacons. And what the synod ended up doing with that was saying, no, you can't have women deacons. But then they acknowledged there's some churches that have deaconesses, and that's, I'm trying to find the exact wording here. It said we affirm the right of a local church to have a separate body of unordained women who may be called deaconesses. And so that's in the history of the RPCES. I think it was alluded to in the study committee. From my perspective, I don't really have a whole lot of sympathy for churches that say we have women deacons because the BCO says you can't. I don't really have a whole lot of sympathy for we have, under commissioned deacons, or we don't have a diaconate. But I wonder for churches that came out of the RPCS, they've always had, they had this in the RPCS. It never made it into the form of government in the RPCS, we should say. It was just, kind of pious advice of a couple of synods that would say this whenever they asked for women deacons. They said, no, it's almost like we have women deacons at home, they're deaconesses, or, but they never said yes to ordaining women deacons, but they did say, at least by a synod pronouncement 50 years ago, deaconesses.
In a different denomination.
Yeah, but some of those churches came into the PCA, large churches, maybe in Philadelphia area. What are your thoughts though on that? Of like, because I agree with you, it's unwise. What do people hear when they hear that? But what do those churches do that say we've had this practice for a long time? We feel like people understand it. Maybe they don't. Like, what would you say to a church if that was a pushback or an objection that they had? I'm just interested to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, let me say three things, if I can remember the three things that are in my mind. The first is that my understanding when joining and receiving happened, they joined the PCA and everyone became the PCA. There was no churches that were then grandmothered in. And then if you apply that logic and say, well, we're going to grandmother this church in, what part is grandmothered? Their practice that continues, or do the people who were deaconesses remain deaconesses? I think that's something that I'd push back. When I first started, that was my major concern, the use of a title of deaconess. As I've researched and read more, that becomes less of a concern to me, particularly if it's an informal thing that the session select and appoint godly men, women specifically, and call them deaconesses in an unofficial capacity. What do you call men? That's a challenge. They're male deaconesses.
That's right. That's what I've always said.
But I am more and more concerned, not merely just about what you call them, what title you give them. I think it's unwise, and unless people know that, and it's very, very clear. But when you start to be able to go through the whole process and say, well, they're elected by the congregation. Well, election in the BCO is very, very specific. They're trained alongside deacons to be able to do the role and function of deacons. They're nominated, elected, trained, elected. They're installed alongside deacons, and they take vows like deacons. We pray for them, and we set them apart, and we give them a charge, but we don't lay hands on them. We're going to call them deaconesses.
But recently, the church took it all down. But there were pictures posted on Instagram of a church where there were unordained people. We know this because they were women laying hands on elders who were being installed. It was just, but it's so eclectic. It's all non-standard. You can't go in the book and get instructions for these churches that install deaconesses along with deacons. And when you stop ordaining your male deacons and then you just install them, there's no differentiation between the males and females searching. But again, we get caught up. We're dudes. We talk about the male-female thing. Ultimately, ordination is the matter here. And I hope we'll talk about that before we finish. But it is so confusing. It's almost impossible to quantify and define. And another problem I have, there's no standard way to accept for the session appointing deacon assistants. When my session does that, we appoint them for a year. And then if we don't reappoint them, they don't serve anymore. It's not like an office. But there's no way, there's no standard for removing these people. If they're elected, can the session remove them? I mean, that's an issue. If the congregation chose them, can the session unchoose them arbitrarily? But if these people who were elected or appointed by non-standard practices, whether they're males or females, they've got no standing in the courts. There is no special, if they go in the BCO and start looking for how can I be removed, what are my rights and duties, it's not in there because the local church made it up, and the local church can't modify the BCO willy-nilly. So there's so many layers of problems and the hypotheticals. I mean, sooner or later, the SJC is going to get a complaint from a deaconess or a non-ordained deacon about how the session treated them, and the SJC is going to say, "We can't help you. You're just a church member, and you don't even have standing here." So it's to me, it just it makes my head hurt. Maybe it's making other people's heads hurt as well. So,
and that's what I keep on coming back to, is there's all these hypotheticals. And so back to Jared's question, can you use that term? Well, if it's going to cause confusion and division in the church, then why not just use a clearer term that we see in our BCO, like diaconal assistant or assistant to the diaconate? 9-7 is very, very clear. And if churches were just to be able to sit down and say, okay, how do we do this? Instead of going through all this process, the session selects and appoints godly men and women of the diaconate to be able to help and assist the deacons in specific functions, caring for the sick, visiting particular people, helping those in distress. That to me just seems like, why are we overcomplicating something that I think is already clear? And so I think that, to me, is what I would encourage churches to do. Maybe you do have a practice of deaconesses, and maybe it's very, very clear. My assumption is that this practice is not merely just RPCES churches who joined and received under the PCA are grandmothered in. My assumption is this practice is probably coming into more newer churches that are being planted and established. And so again, I just, why all this confusion when we have something clear? Why add extra burden to the congregation to be able to nominate and elect people when it's put on the session to be able to anoint and select?
You said anoint, appoint, not
yes,
anoint.
Select and
Yes.
appoint, yes.
Yes, we don't keep oil in the session meetings typically, but
Oh.
yeah.
Well, I do have some respect though for those who want to do an overture, who say, I think we do need to change this and have some sort of scriptural reasons. New York, Metro New York was at least thinking about doing that a few years ago. And you at least have to respect, okay, we're going to put our money where our mouth is in doing something like that, rather than trying to get around the process. I think it's, as I was researching that, because I wrote an article on that, RPCES, there was a Presbyterian that eventually said, hey, can you put the deaconesses in the form of government? And the Senate was like, no. So never did make it in the form of government, even in that form.
So let's talk about the right way to change it, which is by overture and by amending the Constitution, which is not easy. In 2018, as Jared said, New York Metro Presbytery, they had an overture. It was about 11 pages, because you have to change a lot in the directory for worship, about how to install officers. It affects many parts of the BCO. They voted and approved that overture from the Presbytery. It got posted on the GA website, and then it was withdrawn. And I don't even think the Presbytery met to withdraw it. I think they just somebody got in their ear and said, this is not going to fly, this is not a good idea, and it went away. I saved it because it was of interest to me then, just as it is now. I've shared it with some of you all. And we're not going to talk about which presbytery or even which part of the country, but we're given to understand that at least one presbytery, maybe two, maybe 2 churches and 1 presbytery, have written overtures that will be considered by presbyteries to make women deacons, a unisex office of deacon. And that may make it to General Assembly this year, and it may not. It's going to be a big deal if it does. I think the chance of it passing is very, very small, but it's going to create a lot of discussion, and that's one of the reasons we're doing this show, to get ahead. I mean, it's only 6 or 7 months to General Assembly, so it's not too early. It's not too early, is it, Dave, to start with this mania that we have? Certainly not.
No, it's never too early to think about overtures. For
not that you serve with someone who doesn't think about them all the time.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Me either.
No, let's just stack them up like cordwood. No, I think there's something to that, and let's have the overtures. Let's have the conversation. Let's reason together about this. Let's see what's really going on. It's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible that I'm actually in the minority of the PCA, and that you've got a bunch of churches and elders across the denomination who actually think we should have female deacons. And it turns out that we're actually sort of this sub rosa egalitarian body, and that I'm actually out of accord with my brothers. And it would be useful to know that. And it would be useful to have the conversation. This is one of those times when, I'm not sure that overtures is the best way to do this, because, that's that sort of delegated assembly, right? Where you've got a couple guys from every presbytery who go in, and some things just never even make it out of overtures. They don't get to the assembly, so you don't get to talk about them. But in any event, that's a more honest way to go about it, right? I get the sense with the way that some of these churches handle these things, where they won't put things on their website. I mean, I came across a church somewhere on the East Coast, maybe Maryland, I'm not sure. So this was a couple months ago, because I was just curious, where you can look at this very slick modern website that includes sermon audio. It includes, automatically loading videos and all these things. You can sign up to do stuff on. I mean, this is not like a Windows 95 website. I mean, this is like a legit website. But you couldn't find the name of the pastor on it. And you can't tell if there are more than one pastor. You can't tell if they have officers at all. They don't list anybody. And you wonder, are some of these churches doing this because they just don't want to be hassled? They just don't want to deal with the problem. And the problem being, I guess, certain of us who would cause trouble about it, who would make a report or would file a complaint. And so maybe we're the baddies.
Since a year and a half ago, when the titles overture passed and was ratified a year and a half ago, there have been a lot of churches take things off their website or clean, and some have cleaned it up and are using proper terms now. But it's actually illegal to call an unordained person by the title of an ordained office now. That's a change, and someone on our panel tonight was probably wrote that overture, but we won't say who it was. But that was a big deal, and it's prompted things. It's stirred things up, and it's going to bring this issue to a head. And I think this year, in 2026, when I say this year, this coming year, so that's the constitutional process to change things. Is to bring an overture requesting amendment. But what rubs me the wrong way is I think we've imported secular politics and polity into the church when we try to change something by civil, or in this case, ecclesial disobedience. We're just not going to follow the book. We hope other people will adopt our practice, and pretty soon it's just become a fact. And it's kind of a dialectical process, push and shove, the constitutional way and the way we want, and they collide, and something new emerges from it. But it's all informal, and it's all off the books. It's an influence operation. And, I think it'd be all right if we were protesting something very important civilly. I don't think we need to disobey the police, but there's a kind of, in extreme cases, we could say, no, we're not going to comply. We saw that in the civil rights movement. We see it sometimes wisely, sometimes unwisely, with the anti-abortion protesters and movements. But it's not our process. That's not how we change things in the church. We're not a secular political influence operation, and those are the tactics that have been used. And I just wish we would settle it, and we could then really we would be more unified. I think we're unified by the way we worship and what we believe. But there's a lot of nuance in our doctrine sometimes, and we know there's a great existing freedom of worship that's always been there. But what shouldn't be infinitely adjustable, locally contextual, boy, this is a word, contextualizable, or just if it feels good, do it, is our polity. That's really what binds us together. As Thomas said earlier, we're a Presbyterian church. We're elder ruled, but we have our two offices, and that's what should characterize every church across the denomination. And that's just not what we see now. Thomas, I've got the PCA, I've got the deacon assistants on the screen for people that want to see that. That's the clear way of handling these things. You also talked about, Thomas, the influence of study committees and of SJC decisions, and I think we ought to hit that carefully. I've often said that in the PCA we have a pope, and his name is Pope Precedent. He's Pope Precedent the last. And it's the idea, and this touches on the RPCES thing, if anyone among us has ever been allowed to do something, then that should continue in perpetuity. There is a precedent for it, so it would be mean or unreasonable to say no. To say no, we know that's happened. We're gonna follow the book now. That's the Pope precedent, and because study committees can have a similar cachet, and sometimes people will appeal to, well, this case went before the SJC and they ruled this way or that way. But talk about that briefly, because and generally.
Yeah, so all this started with a short, long, but short little arguments. Basically, all these are arguments that are made on Presbyterian polity early in the year. And two of the arguments were based on an SJC decision in 2007. 13 is the case number. And basically, a church gave a woman, a title of minister of something. And so there was a complaint sent up, and the SJC sided with the presbytery, but they said that it was unwise and unequitable for the welfare of the church to be able to do that. The dissenting opinion, actually, I can't remember if it's dissenting or concurring, actually has a lot of good things in it. I'd encourage people to read that. Although that's different, the point was that basically the title given to a person, kind of what Dave was saying before about that legal civil rights of a entity of a corporate body. And then the study committee report at the end gives recommendations. They recommend that we use 9-7.
This is from 2017, Jared. When was or maybe it was 18. Not sure, but you can go back. It's easy to find on the PCA Historical Center website. And
so they recommended, one of the recommendations was a presbytery send up an overture to be able to create something called a commissioned church worker.
And that never happened.
No. And so they kind of said it doesn't need a BCO change, but then they said to officially adopt something like this. And so, when we talk about these type of things, we need to understand that issue of precedent, but with the SJC, it's very, very specific. So the BCO changes, and so if a BCO changes, then outcome of a case can change. Even if the BCO doesn't change, the outcome of the case can change because there's a different body. But more importantly, what determines the outcome is more likely the record of the case that is sent up. And so the SJC cannot take up anything that's not in the record of the case. They've got to judge the case with what is before them. They can't go and do their own research to be able to find out additional things. And a specific case goes before the SJC and is argued by a specific person. And so a similar case can go before the SJC, but a different outcome can come about because the record of the case is different, or the prosecutor argues a different argument. And all of those things can be important to be able to understand. And so there's limitations in the BCO Chapter 39. There's limitations that limit what the SJC decide. And basically the sole authority for the SJC becomes the Constitution and the Word of God, the Constitution's interpretation. And so an SJC decision, even if two identical cases went before the SJC, that doesn't mean that it stands. But also the SJC doesn't have to follow precedent either, as well. So I think that's important for us to understand that if we think that this is going to be solved with an SJC ruling, I don't think that is going to be the case. And then study committee reports, they're very interesting. They come before, they're written by about 7 or 8 different people. They come before an assembly. We get an hour presentation. We get to be able to read the report. Imagine if someone said, I want to go through and amend that and strike certain lines and to change certain words. That would be a very long process. But the point that I make in this is that we don't even have that standard of requiring people to submit to our, through good faith subscription, to every line and affirmation of every statement and proposition in our standards. And yet some people go and turn to a study report and say, see this line here? That supports my case or my reasoning. And so we need to use those things, SJC decisions and the study committee reports, for what they are: helpful guides and aids to the church. Even again, a directory for worship. If someone was to go to a church and say, this is what you shall do in a directory of worship, although the General Assembly has said these are agreeable to the Word of God, but not constitutionally binding in all of its parts. And so to be able to even have that same standard for study committee reports, I think is very important for us and how we use them.
Well, we cherry pick. If we like the study committee, we point to it to justify everything that we want. But we point right past the BCO when we do that sometimes. I haven't heard this. Some people say confessionalist. They worship their confession. They make an idol of the Westminster Standards. I haven't heard a lot of people say that, well, you guys worship the BCO. But if we value order and we think it's biblical and we've taken vows that we agree with it and we're going to abide by it, we shouldn't apologize for leaning on our order and pointing to it first. I think, probably the most respected and important of all the study committees was the Creation Study Committee. That is used a lot in examinations for ordaining and licensing officers, but even that is not binding. And Thomas, your presbytery proves that. You all have a different, a narrower view of creation views than that study committee does. I mean, your presbytery is an embodiment of the fact that study committees don't rule us. And some of the things that study committees said about deaconesses, commissioned church workers, women in ministry, you know, we didn't, those of us who are around didn't agree with it at the time, and we're not bound by it. But we are all bound by we're bound by the Constitution of the Church, which is the BCO and the Westminster Standards. That's it. It's pretty simple. But we like to complicate it, and we like to cherry pick. I think helpful lines and items from a variety of sources. All right, so we got about probably 12, 15 minutes left. Let's. I mean, you got 5 articles here, Thomas, and you probably got 5 to come. What have we not talked about that's important? Let's talk about ordination. My big problem with some of these things, when churches stop ordaining deacons, and ordination has a definition. I mean, it's the laying on of hands by the presbytery, by the session or the presbytery, to ordain someone to a specific ecclesial work, and that work is defined in the BCO. But when we stop ordaining people who could be ordained, or we ordain people who shouldn't be ordained, or we modify the vows and the ceremonies in confusing ways, we're undermining that whole doctrine of ordination, which means we're undermining the offices in general. But what are you, when you're going to write about ordination, but what are you going to say? Because it's a topic that's not taught a lot in seminary. There aren't many books on ordination. It's an underappreciated and really unknown doctrine. We don't believe it's magic. It's kind of like the sacraments. We don't think they're magic, and we don't think they're meaningless. But what are you going to say about ordination when you get to that?
I'm not sure yet. 9:48 at night, it's hard to articulate. But again,
normally we'd be an hour later, so you get no excuse here.
Well, that's normally for you doesn't mean you're articulate for me. But again, going back to why we do ordination and why is that specific terminology and why do we lay on hands? It's commanded in Scripture. We see it clearly where Paul instructs Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4, and he says, "Do not neglect the gift that was given to you, that was given to you by the prophecy when the council of the elders laid on their hands." That here, what we see is that the authority of the church is not in individuals deciding if they want to be ordained or not. The authority comes from Christ, and Christ commissioned his and gave authority to his elders and authority to his apostles. And so we see that passing on. And so for Timothy, he's set apart for that specific calling. And Paul is holding him accountable to that. It would be right for Paul later if someone has neglected that gift, has not done what they're called to do. That's a disciplinary offense. Even in our BCO, if a minister doesn't carry out his duties of an ordained elder or deacon, that they're called to live out what they're set apart to do. And so I think, we see that. But again, that authority doesn't lie within a person or even specifically a body. What we're saying in ordination is that the church has elected you to that authority. The people have elected you, and now we're installing you to that call. You can't be ordained and not installed. You have to be installed to a call. And so we see that at work in our life. And when we just merely think that it's this hands-on, if you touch someone, then they're ordained. But if you don't touch someone, then they're not ordained. That's a very superficial understanding of what we're doing in that.
Well, now, so, we talk about hands-free technology. Apparently, there is such a thing as a hands-free ordination. In 2009, when Tim Keller sat down with Ligon Duncan and they talked about these issues, Tim Keller admitted that they no longer laid hands on deacons, but he considered them ordained. And it confused me then, and it still confuses me. And so we have apparent ordinations without the laying on of hands. We have people that say, well, this is not an ordination, but it sure looks like it. And we have people who are called officers who are not ordained. And every office in the PCA, both of them, are ordained offices. There are no unordained officers. And you make the case pretty convincingly that the whole commission thing is pretty suspect. And it's really, I think we could say commissioning is a hands-free ordination. So it's just confusing. That's the first thing. But I think it's worse than confusing ultimately, because it undermines. And there have been overtures in the past that have not made it very far that would require churches to report whether they have ordained, share with us the names of your ordained officers. The BCO says that a church without deacons is in crisis, and that should be a temporary. If you read all the passages in the BCO about this, that is envisioned as only a temporary situation, and it's such a serious issue. If you don't have deacons, which is ordained, qualified men, all the duties of the deacons devolve to the session. Dave, you're a ruling elder. Would you like to, in deference to some principle, stop ordaining deacons so you don't have any, and now you have to do all the deacon things too? Are you interested in that?
I'm not. Although, were that the situation, and I believe the language of the BCO is that if it is impossible,
yes, for any reason,
but I think the key word there is impossible. And so, if it's impossible to have deacons, then yes, I would do what I'm called upon to do, and hopefully with a happy heart and a good attitude, which is the phrase we use with our kids for the last dozen years.
How's that working out? Pretty good.
Pretty good, actually.
Okay, good.
You want to talk about mantras? It's sort of like a mantra. They know it's coming. In any event, it's interesting that because Thomas, you do pick up on this in at least one and maybe two of your articles, that you in some churches, right? And I think that has to be like the preface to every one of these statements. In some churches, it seems that they do have elders, and they have some sort of diaconal something or other, which is a batch of people who may or may not be ordained, probably not, but they're male and female. Maybe they have gospel workers, whatever the term of art is. But if they're not ordaining deacons, one thing that occurred to me in the last couple of days reading through your articles again is there anybody who says that deacons should not be ordained? I can't imagine that anybody would say, no, you should not ordain deacons.
No, I've heard that. I've heard that it's such a difference.
How did they justify that?
Well, that because they don't have authority, which our PCO says they do have some authority, and the vows when deacons are installed, there's a congregational vow that actually where the congregation promises to obey the deacons where that's within the purview, where it's appropriate. But I've heard.
Uh-oh. Did our fearless leader freeze?
Yeah, who's going to host it now?
We agree that that's all right. Now I'm back. I can. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, good. We're back. So I've heard some people say there's no authority associated with the deacon, so they don't have to be ordained. I've heard that argument.
Well, but there's a difference between saying someone doesn't have to be ordained. Clearly, some churches believe that you don't have to ordain deacons. I guess what I'm asking, and maybe this is sort of a pointless question, is there anyone who say you should not ordain a deacon? But really, I'm not sure where that goes, other than to say, you've got this batch of men. So let's just take a hypothetical church that has elders, but then they also have, I don't know, 8 or 10 gospel workers or diaconal team members, or whatever you want to call them.
Mercy team. Mercy team is the most common current term.
Sure, and so half are female, half are male. I would think that the men on that gospel worker team or mercy team or whatever could be ordained, right? These are probably ordainable men if you put them through the training, if you examine them in views and in Christian character and in Bible and theology, and you did a background check and you did all the good stuff you're supposed to do with them, that they would be ordainable. But now you're choosing not to ordain them. So you could ordain them, and then the females on that team, they could easily be deacon assistants or assistants to the deacons or assistants to the general manager, deacon, or whatever it is. You could do that. But they're choosing instead to just not ordain anybody in that sort of diaconal kind of role. And it seems like they're really parsing it. You use the phrase, Thomas, loophole legalism. I mean, it
Yes,
seems like
that's the phrase of the year so far.
I like it. So one thing I'll say, Thomas, that you get a lot of credit for in my mind is your use of alliteration. I appreciate that very much. It makes it memorable. I like it. So thank you. But it seems like they're saying, well, the session doesn't have to do all these things because it's not impossible for us to ordain a deacon. We're just choosing not to ordain a deacon. It's totally possible. We're just choosing not to do it. And I'm sure they don't put it quite that glibly. They're probably not quite that flippant about it. But it does seem like we're parsing things awfully finely here.
Yeah, and I think that's one of my concerns with all of this, is that this is kind of when we start reading what is clear and start making it ambiguous. I think that's that's not good. And why do we ordain people to offices? Because that's what Christ has told. In Acts chapter 6, they tell the congregation to nominate people, 7 men, to the office. Okay, maybe they're not deacons, but what are they then? That seems to be the function of what we see. And what's the function of a deacon? We have it here, I think, would spell out that they're to help devote themselves to that duty so that the elders can focus on word and prayer. And what we see is that they, in verse 6, they set them before the apostles and they prayed and they laid their hands on them. They ordained them. Our BCO says in 17:2, ordination is the authoritative admission of one duly called to an office in the Church of God. And so if we're going to say that, ordination is the authoritative admission, so we're saying you are set apart for that responsibility. But going back to the preface, Christ has given not only the offices, but the officers. He has given the offices, plural, not 1, 2. And if we're going to have a 2-office view, and elder is 1 office and deacon is another, then you can't lose that S. Christ has given 2 offices, but he's also given officers, specific men that he gifts his church with to lead and guide his church, godly, qualified men who shepherd his flock and administer mercy to those in need in our church. And so back to that principle that I think it's so vital and important, that Christ has blessed us with godly deacons. And if we're not ordaining them to that position, and specifically as Christ has taught us in his word, and how our BCO agrees with that understanding, that's concerning. And why are we doing it? I mean, again, it's hard writing all of these articles not to be able to delve into motives of what the other people are thinking. But yeah, why? Christ has blessed us with these things. And why do we think that we're not blessed by them? And that the church just merely, Presbyterians and Puritans didn't merely just sit down and say, you know what, let's just add some things to our book of church order and practices because, we don't know much about it and we've always done it. They went back time and time again and said, what is it that Scripture has taught? And ordination and the laying on of hands, the prayer, the charge given is an important part of installation as well. And so, I think, again, Christ has blessed his church. Why would we rob people from what Christ has given to his church?
Yeah, and let's reiterate, there's nothing wrong with women. There's nothing wrong with people who can't be or aren't ordained. But there's also nothing wrong with Christ's provision for us. There's nothing wrong with the Bible's teaching about these things, and I don't think there's anything wrong with our BCO. I think it's I don't know. So there was a famous description of evangelicalism back in the 20th century. It talked about a morbid restlessness, a lack of contentment, always looking to change or do something differently. Godliness with contentment is great gain. In that, there is great gain. We should be content with the provision of Christ for His church. That's what you just said, Thomas, and we should humbly comply with our order and change it if necessary by the slow, difficult constitutional process that we have. And that's about all. And again, we focus on women, but ordination is the first issue here. And it really kills me when we quit ordaining people who should be ordained.
Yeah, can I kind of underline that in that I think you're right that we need to do some more work on ordination. There was an article that came out, it was like 4 years ago. Friend of mine named Adam Parker, who wrote an article that was called "Brothers, Ordain Your Deacons," and one of the things he pointed to was Bannerman's treatment, which is about the longest treatment that we have. It's about 15 pages in Bannerman. That's our whole doctrine of Reformed ordination in the English-speaking world sometimes. But we think about ordination sometimes as like authority. We might think about it as bookkeeping to have the right people written in the right slots. But Bannerman makes the point of we think that in order to do these things, that God has made these offices and gifted people. And there's something about ordination that is it's not a sacrament, but it might be something of a minor means of grace that we're asking God to bless these people the Hebrew for ordaining was to fill your hand. What we're doing is we're asking for God to gift the people who are being ordained with the ability to do these things. And what are we robbing the people who are asking to do those things of by not ordaining them? Ordination, there's more to it, I think, than what has been given credit for. And it's not just about bookkeeping. It's not even, I think, just about authority. It's about obeying God and the gifts of God.
Yeah, very good. And hopefully that will encourage. And that was a Ref 21 article, and I found it only on the Aquila Report, the one you referenced by Adam Parker, and it doesn't exist on Ref 21 anymore. So we need Adam Parker, if you're listening, update that article and publish it somewhere new.
It's on placefortruth.org. They just moved it.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe we'll find that and post it. But he could still update it. It'd be a good thing. And he came from an area. He's ministered in an area where there's been lots of conflict over some of these issues. So he's come to his convictions after great struggle and probably making himself unpopular a few times. So speaking of unpopular, we're it. But we don't want to be noxious about these things. We want to be fair, but it's a difficult issue. If you read through all Thomas's articles, he's incredibly charitable, and I like that. He's better at that than I am. So Jared's pretty charitable and moderate too, but it doesn't come through in print with him quite as well as it does with Thomas. So I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. There's much more that could be said about this, and if, as I say, this is the issue of 2026, we'll be doing more shows about this. You're going to hear things. You're going to hear of controversies and rumors of controversies, and you're going to see overtures posted. And we'll try not to do it, every other show, but we'll return to this issue. So thank you all for joining us. And we miss Resby, but he'll be back. And thanks for all the listeners. Pretty big audience tonight. And order and decency in the comments section as well. So thanks to all of you. And I think Resby, if he were here, he would say, don't be, and I'll add, an ecclesial Erdman.